Welcome to the Reason Roundtable podcast, now also on YouTube, as you can hopefully see. It's the weekly podcast brought to you by the magazine Free Minds and Free Markets. I'm Matt Welch, joined by Nick Gillespie, Peter Suderman, and Katherine Mangu-Ward. Good morning, friendies.
Howdy.
Hi, Matt.
Happy Monday.
So over the weekend, our once and future president, Donald J. Trump, said on Fox News with Maria Bartiromo that he would like to see a 60% tariff on all goods coming from China. I'm not a mathematician, but I think what that means is that if you buy the $500 China thing, it's now going to cost $800 if that comes to fruition. Nick will check me up at halftime.
No, I really won't.
Previously, Trump has talked about removing China from most favored nation trading status, which is always hard to say in a row like that. That would effectively be a 40% tariff, depending on how it all shakes out. Plus, he's been talking about a universal baseline tariff on everything, including the non-communist countries, of 10% across the board. So, Katherine, using your human voice, can you explain to the crowd, and including to people who are kind of sympathetic or tariff curious, why you think this would be a terrible idea?
The very, very basic answer to that question is it's just going to make stuff cost more for Americans. And I can't think of like other ways to convey that idea, because it seems like that should be enough. Like, hey, we buy a lot of stuff from China. And if we did this elaborate and punitive tariff plan, we might buy a little bit less stuff, which is the goal, according to tariff backers. We should be less economically engaged with China is sort of fundamentally the idea here. But we wouldn't buy zero stuff. We would still buy quite a lot of stuff. And that stuff would be way more expensive. And I don't know if you know this, Matt, but a thing that people are kind of worried about right now in the economy, in our weird economy that I guess we're going to maybe talk about later, is stuff is expensive. The regular stuff that they just buy feels like it is more expensive than it should be. There are a bunch of reasons for that, but a big one is because we tax the stuff. We put taxes on the stuff. Those taxes would not be paid by an abstract idea that is foreigners. They would be paid by us. And I, for one, would not like to pay more for my stuff. I would just like to buy it from China.
If we put, let's get the red Chinese out of this for a second. If we put a 10% tariff on everything, including the friendies, doesn't that make it more likely for us to build our own stuff? And so then when we give money, we give it to friendly Americans.
It would make us more likely on the margins that we would build our own stuff. But we also have a whole bunch of rules in this country that make that stuff really expensive. So some of the things are artificial, like minimum wage laws or government imposed
child labor laws.
Child labor laws. Some of the things are just that we are a rich country, and so labor just costs a lot more here. But the stuff that we might make here, it's true, would be made here, but it would be more expensive stuff still. And sometimes it would be less good stuff, right? Like other countries have people that are good at making specific things that we're not great at, like semiconductors, and we should buy them from the people that can make them well and cheaply.
Nick, there was a Reuters Ipsos poll last August showing that 66% of Americans said that they would rather vote for a president who wants to have even higher tariffs against red China. If Americans want higher tariffs...
you are like the last guy since Barry McGuire who insists on talking about red China.
I love it so much.
Welch.
Every time Matt says it, it warms my robot
I don't know.
heart.
I feel
Are they
like
not reds?
They're
reds.
Yeah.
But shouldn't the federal government give Americans what they want good and hard?
No.
Why not? Why shouldn't
Because,
there be more
as Katherine was laying out, and this, by the way, we can focus on Trump and his trade wars and the 10% baseline tariff. One thing that is kind of interesting about that, and this is beyond economic theory, it's more political economy. Basically, what he's saying is he is going to any country that has a tariff on our stuff, he is going to punish them by doing the same tariff or worse. And that's kind of an interesting jawboning exercise. But, one of the great triumphs, and Matt Welch, you've written about this endlessly. It seems like you can't shut up about it in many contexts, but one of the great triumphs of the past 30, 40 years has been the reduction in global tariffs. Generally speaking, that has been a boon to people in poor countries and people in wealthier countries. So, tariffs are a tax, as Katherine was pointing out, and they're not paid. They're not going to be paid by communist Chinese, party members. They're going to be paid by working class people, who have the least amount of discretionary income. When you shop at Walmart, and 90% of the stuff in Walmart probably comes from China or pretty close. That all goes up by 60%, and then most of the other stuff is actually coming from other countries, so that goes up 10%. That's not. I don't think that's great, and it's not going to increase jobs. So that analysis, when you increase exports, you increase jobs. When when you increase imports, you generally increase buying power, purchasing power.
It's really remarkable that after 3.5 years of griping about inflation, Republicans are preparing to nominate a man whose signature policy would dramatically raise prices for most Americans. But tariffs don't just raise prices for Americans. What they also do is hurt American producers. And it is a somewhat forgotten fact that in 2018 and 2019, when Trump was initially raising tariffs on some Chinese goods, you had Trump also passed a $30 billion bailout fund for American farmers. So that cost Americans money. That was $30 billion because China put up retaliatory tariffs. So there's no such thing as a one-way tariff. This is why we call trade wars, is because one country fires a tariff shot and then the other country fires a tariff shot back. And that is bad. Wars are bad. Trade wars are bad. And Trump wants to start one very badly, it appears, with China.
Peter, a follow-up question, if you will, if I will, or if anyone will. In all of the articles,
if not you, who, Matt?
I think we know.
If not now, when?
Question. In all these
podcast
a lot of articles,
so we have a lot of time.
Globalist, cuck press out there, and they've been overwhelmingly negative about Trump and tariffs. And in paragraph 17, you'll get to, and Joe Biden, since taking office, has largely kept Donald Trump's 2018 tariffs in place. We're going to talk about the aforementioned weird economy a little bit later, but can you talk to us just a little bit about what, if any, daylight there is existing between Joe Biden, President Joseph Robinette Biden, the third, his tariff policy, and Donald Trump's?
The daylight that exists is that Trump is proposing draconian, ridiculous, like Fantasyland tariffs of 60%, like we mentioned earlier. And I don't see Joe Biden proposing that. At the same time, Biden does seem to be continuing the trade policy, the tariff policy that was put in place under the Trump administration. And I think we would see maybe not a sort of a nuclear trade war like we might see under Donald Trump, but a kind of a trade war like a proxy trade war under Joe Biden.
Conventional weapons trade
just
war.
Conventional weapons, right? A small war of the kind that Joe Biden seems to be very much in the mood to start these days.
Drones
well, and
Houthis.
Biden also is big on the Buy America stuff, which is, again, to keep money and dollars in industry here. And that's also bullshit that has the bad effect of making things cost more, but also it just means stuff doesn't get done. Part of this, Matt, is, and this is kind of out of fashion, but to talk about things like comparative advantage, where, do you want one of the industries that has mostly gone missing over the past 60 years in America is the textile industry. And do you really want your kids to grow up to be like hooking carpets? Is that your dream? Make America great again by bringing back chimney sweeps and coal child coal miners and stuff like that. It's stupid.
Loom erasure.
We should be doing better
developments in economic history.
We should be doing better, higher end, higher level industry as well as services and things like that. And that is part of, this has been, I think, a failure on the part of liberal economics or economists and libertarians, as well as conservatives who aren't idiots, and a lot of liberal, including liberal progressives, who will do whatever they can for union workers, which often means becoming protectionist. But it's a better world when you can buy lots of stuff from lots of different places. And, people in America are working less in factories and more in offices or, whatever.
Yeah, so the Biden administration's trade policy has often not been directly through tariffs, even though, like I said, they have continued most of the Trump tariff policy. They have pushed industrial policy through subsidies, through defense of the Jones Act, through policies designed to promote, encourage, or require union work. And that has made everything more expensive as well.
Katherine, Nikki Haley, your Republican girlfriend,
her Boston marriage partner.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What's
spinsters.
Boston marriage partner mean?
That's when the two spinsters live together.
Yeah, Matt. Figure it out,
spinsters.
Matt. God, he's always the last to know.
I've only had
West Coast,
Boston.
F Boston.
He's like, Liberace just never found the right girl. God.
Not wrong. Not inaccurate.
That is true, actually, I guess.
Nikki Haley, who's competing against Donald Trump, is currently behind by about 55 percentage points nationwide and 26 percentage points in her home state of South Carolina, which has the next significant primary in the calendar. She's running against Donald Trump's tariffs. I'll read you some quotes. What Donald Trump's about to do is he's going to raise every household's expenses by $2,600 a year. I will push, she said, and can you believe he's going to do that? And then she also says about China, I will push Congress to revoke permanent normal trade relations until the flow of fentanyl ends. If China wants to start normal trade again, it has to stop killing Americans. What is your take on the free trade position inside the Republican Party, given those quotes?
Seems like maybe it's utterly incoherent and will not be able to be implemented in any meaningful way ever. So there's that. Obviously, fentanyl not only poisons actual human beings, sometimes very horribly and tragically, it has utterly poisoned our discourse about everything, right? Like the idea that we are talking about trade policy and that we slide backwards right into fentanyl every time. We're talking about immigration policy, it's about fentanyl. We're talking about, tax policy probably is somehow about fentanyl. I don't think I've seen that move yet, but give it time. It's only February. The idea that is a reasonable condition for having, open trade with any nation is absurd. But more importantly, at least someone is saying sometimes the reasonable thing. She also just said, this is going to raise the cost of everything from baby strollers to appliances. This is the truth, right? This is a very middle-class families can't afford that. She is correct. She is wrong about many things, including, I just feel compelled to say this every time I say something nice about her. She is a horrific warmonger who will result in dead babies, et cetera, et cetera. But and she is wrong about making fentanyl.
But those
somehow.
Babies' carriages will be slightly cheaper.
The babies will be in cheap carriages, at least. This is just a very, very obvious economic observation. This is not some kind of high level point, and it's disappointing that so many people in Washington who definitely know better, right? It's similar to the Mexico's going to pay for the wall thing. I truly believe that no one who's ever said that sentence believes that it's true. And the same is true with these tariffs. It is simply not true that the costs will be borne only by foreigners. Even if they were, it would still be bad policy. But that's not true anyway.
I think that Stephen Miller believes both of those things.
Can we call fentanyl analog Instagram?
No.
Right? Because isn't it?
Because Instagram is digital fentanyl.
If Instagram is therefore by the... Yeah.
I think it's actually TikTok that's digital fentanyl, and Instagram is whatever the one level down is.
Instagram's just digital heroin, and TikTok is digital fentanyl. Yeah. That's actually the hierarchy that people who want to ban.
You want heroin.
Instagram is digital baking powder.
digital
Matt, what
baby
about the
powder
good
in a
things?
baggie
What about
that people
the
are
good things
pretending
that Trump has promised to enact if he
No.
comes in? And I was looking at this. Well, he wants to drill, baby, drill. He's very big on getting back to an open energy policy.
Nick,
And-
I promise you, we will talk about drill, baby, drill when we talk about drill, baby, drill. But for this episode, when we're talking about trade, we're going to talk about trade.
I thought we were talking about what Trump plans to do when he gets into office.
That was all.
Sorry, I misread.
3 episodes back as well, which is a fine listen. Peter, let's get into the aforementioned weird economy, because it's been kind of weirdly great, at least the numbers that have crossed over the transom. Last Friday, there was a jobs report, scorching jobs report, according to CNBC or Reuters or one of these places. They all just paste each other's headlines anyways. 353,000 jobs, way above what we expected. Growth high, inflation not so high, etc. And yet, Peter Suderman, you had the temerity to have an article in Reason magazine,
a cover story,
big feature cover story. I'm going to compare 2 headlines. First, headlines from Axios last week. U.S. winning world economic war. The United States economy grew faster than any other large advanced economy last year by a wide margin and is on track to do so again in 2024, says Axios. And they've got bullet points. Peter's is
brevity.
The bankruptcy of Bidenomics. Biden's economic policies gave us 3 years of excessive, wasteful, and poorly targeted federal spending. Who's right, Peter? You or the bullet points?
Well, the bullet points they're breezy and easy to read, and so I would encourage you to just stick with them. No, there are 2 ways to think about the Biden economy and Bidenomics, and one is that based on many economic fundamentals, the American economy is in reasonably good shape. And I would just say that the two big stats there are jobs and inflation. Inflation has come way down from its peak in the summer of 2022, and it's now somewhere in the range of 3%, which is not nothing, but is just far down from the 9% or so annualized inflation that we were seeing in 2022. And then you have these consistently good jobs reports. This is actually one reason, at least part of the reason I think we have some of the chaos at the border, is because the job market in the United States, especially for lower skilled labor, is actually quite good. And so if you just look at the state of the economy, I think it's fair to say that the American economy is doing pretty well. But Joe Biden spent much of 2023 touring the country, trying to convince people that the economy was great, not just on the merits, but because of the policies that he had passed, starting with the American Rescue Plan at the beginning of 2021, which was a $2 trillion bill passed on a partisan basis, so just Democratic votes, and then the Inflation Reduction Act, and then the CHIPS and Science Act, which followed both of those. But all of these were big spending policies. And Biden wants to say, well, those are the things that caused the economy to be great. And if you start with the American Rescue Plan, that was a $2 trillion, like I said, partisan plan that contributed to the rise in inflation. And people said, this is going to cause inflation. But Joe Biden wanted to hand out checks, and he wanted to hand out a bunch of money to constituencies. Donald Trump had handed out checks to most Americans the year before. Biden had campaigned on that, and had said before he went into office, well, we're going to give everybody money too. So he wanted to do that. And guess what happened as a result? We had record inflation, the highest inflation levels in 40 years. And then after that, we have the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS and Science Act. Well, the Inflation Reduction Act, no one actually thinks that it's really about reducing inflation. No one, including Joe Biden. So there was a little missed remark from Biden about a year after it passed. He was at a fundraiser. You can go to the White House report on this and see his remarks in which he pointed to a big chunk of money in the Inflation Reduction Act. Like, it's not about reducing inflation at all, actually. It's just about subsidizing the biggest amount of money that we've ever put into fighting climate change and and pushing green technology, stuff like EVs, right? Stuff like EV charging stations. No one has ever spent that. That is a real Biden quote that he was bragging about. And I think that quote is so telling, and it's so revealing about the Biden approach to the economy. It's no one has ever spent that. And then you flash forward another year to the end of 2023. And sorry, that's not a full year. You flash forward to the end of 2023, and you see these reports about how none of these charging stations have been built. It's actually, at this point, I think a handful of them have, in fact, been built, but most of the states don't even have plans for building them. Biden is apparently complaining to his staff that none of the stuff that he had hoped to pose in front of in 2024 while he was campaigning, it hasn't been built yet. And you know why it hasn't been built? Yeah, it's very sad. It's very sad.
Joe Biden.
We spend all of this money to build stuff on the promise that we were gonna build things and do big things in America again. And guess what happened? We spent all of that money, and there's nothing to stand in front of. There's nothing to show for it. And part of the reason is because Joe Biden imposed all of these policies that these requirements on that spending. You had manufacturers. If you're going to build a factory, you got to also provide on-site childcare. Right? The EVs have Buy American rules that they suspended because they weren't working. There's just all of these requirements that slow everything down and mean that we're spending a ton of money. We don't have a whole lot to show for it, and that's what Bidenomics, the policy agenda, actually is. A lot of spending and not much to show for it.
I just hope that our windows have been weatherized by now through his heroic work on the.
I appreciate that you are like.
I'm not going to let go.
Never forget. You're never forget on the weatherizing.
Recovery through retrofit.
Weather stripping.
Live it, learn it, love it.
Nick,
I got to tell you, new windows though are pretty fantastic.
I wish I had
if you
one
were
right
still
here.
living in shutter and sash type stuff, it's a whole new world.
Based on the occasional sirens that I hear in the background of this podcast, it does not seem like the window weatherization has proceeded fully.
I'm pretty sure the windows in my apartment are from like the first FDR administration or something.
I think they were built during the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire. Nick, I stepped on your line earlier making a comparative with Donald J. Trump. I would invite you to maybe look at that again. And are there areas besides idiotic, gigantic across the board tariffs, proposed tariffs even in excess of the ones that Biden has kept around from Trump, in which Trump, compared to Bidenomics, seems clearly better in your eyes?
No, not particularly. Okay. Or in this sense, there was slow and steady growth throughout his presidency up till COVID. I'm convinced by David Stockman's critique, the former Reagan budget director who I interviewed a couple weeks ago in New York. It's up online at Reason and YouTube and stuff. But, that Trump really, growth could have been much bigger under Trump if he hadn't been such an idiot, as well as his COVID policies were terrible. And he was the cheerleader for lockdown. So we should remember all of that, and also giving large sums of money. Biden continued and expanded a lot of that stuff. What worries me as much as anything right now about the weird economy that you're talking about, Matt, is just that labor force participation rate is flat from a year ago. So like, if this economy is so great, why aren't more people working in working age situations? And in the peak years of that, from people age 25 to 54, labor force participation rate has actually declined a bit from last September.
Wow.
So there's something funky going on. And I mean, I'm trying not to just, be like, okay, well, we have to be contrarian because Biden's policies are terrible, so the outcomes must be terrible. But there is a palpable sense of, dread or gloom or uncertainty. And what this is reminding me of in a lot of ways is, it's partly because it's an election year and we have the two shittiest choices in front of us since 2020 and 2016. And, people are going to be kind of like, everybody is kind of waiting to see what happens. And it's not even necessarily because I want my guy to win, but it's like there will be a pause after the election or a slight return to normalcy once we know. But I don't think the economy is as good as people are, as much as the headlines are trying to say. And I think you can also see a crank up in legacy media in particular of like, no, really, the economy is not just good. It's great. We are winning the world war, Matt. Axios says so. So I think there's something here. We're going to see whatever English can be put on this ball in a Biden mode is going to, it's going to be there. Core inflation is still, which is inflation absent Energy and food is still at about 4%, which is down from a peak of almost 7% a couple of years ago. But it's also substantially higher than it was before the pandemic. So people are feeling a pinch, and we've kind of nestled into a new normal that is not good. It's not as good as it was. So there's lots of reasons to be nervous about the economy.
On the labor force participation point, it's just worth noting that the pandemic pulled a lot of people out of the labor force just because things closed or things were forced to close. Just the economy got very weird during 2020. But then what happened was under both Trump and then Biden in 2021, there were payments made to most Americans, and those payments swelled bank accounts. You saw the highest rate of savings in 2021 and then going into 2022 in decades, maybe ever. And what that did was it made it easier for people to not re-enter the labor force. And one thing we know about work is that the longer you are out of work, the longer you don't work, the less likely you are to come back to work. And so part of what they did was subsidize worklessness.
I like that word.
Worklessness. Well, and there's also a long-term readjustment going on in the economy. The labor force participation rate peaked in 2000. Roughly at 67%. It's about 62.5% overall. And it's been pretty flat. Like, it hasn't been able to get back up to where it was for many years. So that's also something that's happening here. There's a very long-term economic restructuring going on. And that is worrying because we got to get to whatever the new economy is. And it feels like we're in a kind of Sitzkrieg if we're going to keep going with the war metaphors.
Katherine, and yet, isn't Axios correct? The United States economy grew faster than any other large advanced economy last year by a wide margin, and it will do again this year. Is it possible the libertarians just love to complain, and maybe it's all fine because America?
Those things are all true. Libertarians do love to complain. I spent the weekend at the Students for Liberty annual conference, LibertyCon, and there was indeed some complaining, though I will say it was an international crowd. And so the Americans' complaints did immediately pale in comparison, right? It was like, things are so bad here. And people were like, I'm from Venezuela. You know what I mean? So there was that. And there is this element of truth, which is like the American economy still has these just incredible, world historically unprecedented strengths. And so we do have that. But I think this is less about attempting to find out a true answer about the strength or weaknesses of the U.S. economy and just more about how these jerks are running for office. And so it's just 100% motivated reasoning. So much of this debate is, what are the words I can say that will help my team the most? And those of us who don't have a team can do our best to figure it out in between. But I think saying, you are wrong, everything is fine, when people like come home with their little small bag of groceries that used to, that cost them as much as what used to be 4 bags of groceries is not, I struggle to believe that's going to be an effective electoral strategy. And I think we should pay attention to little scary corners of the economy, even if some of the big numbers are good.
In fact, as Biden toured the country making the case for Bidenomics last year, he kept saying, well, this is Bidenomics in action. It's working. It's working. And if you looked at the polling on trust in his ability to handle the economy from the middle of 2023 through the end of 2023, which is basically the period of time in which he was making that case, it actually got worse. It started bad and it got worse. And Biden's job approval rating has not really recovered here in the last 6 weeks, even as we have seen some small shifts in consumer sentiment.
Katherine, please tell me that there were some afuera shirts at LibertyCon?
In fact, one of the groups that received a prize during the dinner on Saturday night was a group from Argentina, and they were enthused. They were bringing a lot of afuera to the situation. They had a flag, and it was you don't see those kind of vibes at libertarian conferences necessarily, but
they were really ebullient and exciting, intoxicating.
It was great. I actually got home and was talking with my family about the conference, and we ended up in a situation where I was showing my children a photo of Javier Milei with the chainsaw, and my daughter said, "Wait, so like a libertarian is in charge of a country with this like incredible incredulity in her voice. And I was like, that's fair. That's fair.
All right, we're going to get to our listener email of the week here in a moment. But first, the world would be a better, freer, and happier place if the Constitution's pre-existing protections for private property were taken more seriously. That's why our pals over the Institute for Justice, American Heroes, they have released a new season of their hit legal history podcast, Bound by Oath. Bound by Oath tells the story of how the Supreme Court has cleared the way for government officials to abuse property rights, to trespass on private land without a warrant, to restrict peaceful and productive uses of property. It's okay to hiss, by the way. To seize and keep property without sufficient justification, and many more outrages. Featuring interviews not only with scholars and litigators, but also with the real-life people behind some of the Supreme Court's most notorious property rights decisions. The new season explores the history behind today's civil rights battles. Please do look up Bound by Oath wherever you get your podcasts. It's Bound by Oath, Institute for Justice, Property Rights, hissing. Do it today. You'll be glad you did. Thank you, Nick, for that. All right, reminder to email your to-the-point queries to roundtable@reason.com. This one comes from Chris Geary, who writes, I'd like your thoughts on the idea that, to improve our collective sense-making, it should become a norm for at least all non-opinion news outlets to require their journalists to disclose their voting records. Reason did, he says, something similar, yes. And I think this would be immensely helpful in at least 4 ways. 1, it provides the reader with information that's important context to the story, the postmodern consideration. 2, it establishes a baseline of trust between journalist and recipient. I'm putting my cards on the table. 3, it would encourage the journalist to try to be more balanced in reporting because journo knows what bias reader will be looking for, so journo will want to proactively counter it. And 4, it would hopefully shame the publisher into seeking out and hiring journalists with different outlooks, which Jonathan Rauch tells us is necessary for the constitution of knowledge to actually work. I'm sure there would be downsides too, but thoughts. I have many thoughts. We'll get to them. But Katherine, do you want to lead off?
Yes. So the letter writer is correct. Reason does do this, has been doing this for a long time. And especially points 1 and 2 are mostly the reasons we do it. I am deeply skeptical that point 4 has very much power because the other publication that has done this in the past with some consistency, although I don't think they do it anymore, is Slate, where they're like, they make academia look ideologically diverse. It's really something. And people don't have any shame about it. I mean, we have these findings over and over and over in all of our elite institutions that they are overwhelmingly not just kind of philosophically liberal in disposition, but democratically partisan at a over 90% level, everywhere, absolutely everywhere. And no one seems to be embarrassed. No one is ashamed. Reason does it. We will probably do it again. And when we do it, a bunch of people are going to get their panties in a bunch about it. Because someone on our staff...
because everybody at Reason votes for Norman Thomas, right?
Someone on our staff is going to vote a way that they don't like. And even if in their text of their explanation, they say, this is the most grudging possible vote. This is being dragged from me by wild horses only due to a tiny reason why this person is marginally less bad than the other person or whatever. The brain poisoning of partisanship is so bad that people will say, look, I added up all the votes and, there was 1 Biden voter and 2 Trump voters and everyone else basically just screamed, into their answer. But, that means that Reason endorsed Donald Trump. Right. And that's I wish that people wouldn't do that because I don't think that's the point of the exercise. But what I think is the point doesn't matter. The whole idea of it is you put it out there and people do with this information what they will. So
if I may, Matt, I want to thank you for introducing that awful feature to Reason.
Yep.
That came in when you darkened our door and pushed me as editor of the print magazine at the time to do it. What I found most interesting about the way we do it at Reason was that, people also talked about previous votes and then some other question, and that we bring in people in our universe that you wouldn't necessarily hear about. So it could be Penn Jillette or our, cartoonist Peter Bagg or thinkers like Stuart Brand, people who are adjacent to us. And that it just becomes an interesting discussion of what's going on during a presidential election year, but also what is a wide range of people, who are they voting for and why? That can be kind of interesting. I think what the letter writer is getting at, and this is a very different question, at the New York Times or, the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or, media that pretends to be objective, that would be genuinely fascinating. Even if they just tabulated without giving the names, they can anonymize the data and just say, we polled X number of staffers who write on a daily basis, and this is the breakdown of who's voting for whom or who's not voting. I've met, and I'm struggling to remember any of their names, but that's because I'm struggling to remember all names at this point in my life. But I've met a bunch of high profile legacy media journalists who say, I don't vote because I would be compromised somehow. I think that's stupid, but I kind of respect that. But I would love to see this. I don't think it can be interesting as a feature in publications like Slade if they were ever interesting. And it can be interesting. It is interesting in Reason style publications. But the most interesting thing would be in these other objective groups. And I would like to see that become a norm.
I do love the weird reversal of cause and effect that comes in that line that you just mentioned, Nick. Like, I don't hear it as much anymore. And I guess I never thought I would miss it, but now I do. But it was a very, very common thing for journalists to say, I don't vote because that would bias me. Which is both like, what? No, like the bias would certainly pre-exist the vote if you were biased, but also is true. Like it also is true that like if you commit to something, then you are more likely to seek out its positive attributes and downplay its negative attributes. Like it's like a weirdly deep psychological insight that I think people are just saying in a stupid way. But I now am retroactively nostalgic for the days when at least some journalists said that, because now almost every journalist at a publication that would describe itself as objective is in fact going to vote for Joe Biden. And many of them will believe that not doing so represents an existential threat to the country and to their own profession.
The other variation on this, which is good for a laugh, is when the Nation used to do this all the time, where they would, in every election, there would be a socialist, a Green Party, somebody who embodied everything they stood for, often named Ralph Nader, and they would always say, Ralph, we agree with you 10,000%, but this election is too important to vote for the person who perfectly encapsulates what we believe. So would you please drop out so we can vote for a candidate that we loathe ideologically, but obviously support with every fiber of our being? And they just do that on an almost regular basis, which is kind of funny.
The Intercept published that exact piece about 7 or 8 days ago, without necessarily lionizing, Cornel West and Jill Stein, but saying, it's,
what a team!
It's too
Could
soon.
they be co-presidents? That's so perfect.
But I was going to say, Katherine, that I my lifelong not belonging to a political party is totally out of that same impulse. Like, I don't want to join anything because I write about this stuff. And also because I'm not a joiner of things at all. Peter,
because you're a moral coward, Matt. Come on.
Thank you.
I just want to note that we now have, we got a letter. I received a letter from one of our listeners noting that tomorrow, if you live in Nevada, you can vote for none of the above. That is now an option.
Yeah,
it's been that way for a while in Nevada.
You, in fact, in the Democratic primary, if the none of these candidates pick reaches 15%, the delegates representing that perspective will go to the nominating convention, unbound to any candidate.
So I just want to say,
things are looking great for none of the
vote?
above right now. So maybe that's a way to get around all of this, bias hacking.
This is like how at WorldCon for a couple of years, the big science fiction convention where they award the Hugo Awards which is maybe the biggest award in science fiction, for a couple of years after a big controversy involving a group called the Sad Puppies. I won't explain it here. Google it, or maybe don't.
Maybe just go touch grass.
But yeah, for a couple of years, some of the big awards were won by no award.
I immediately heard that as some dude named Noah. I was like, so?
Noah Ward. I love his books.
He's a fine writer. Nothing wrong with him.
My brother, actually.
Love his Substack. Touch grass, but not the yellow grass is the idea.
No, don't eat the yellow grass.
So just briefly, I think I would not mind this becoming a norm. At the same time, I don't think the salutary effects that the writer suggests would be all that strong. Salutary, right? So the good effects, the positive ones. And I think there would be a couple of things. One is the thing that Nick already mentioned is that you would probably or possibly have an incentive for many journalists to simply stop voting. And that way they could pretend they are not biased, right? They could say, well, look, I don't vote, and that allows me to not be biased. And that wouldn't be the case. They would still have their biases. Another thing
but at
that
least
would happen,
they wouldn't be voting.
And Katherine would be very happy about that. Nick would not be very happy about that. But it wouldn't end up revealing or shaping the conversation. On the other hand, if they did say, oh, well, here's my voting record, then I think something that would happen is, especially with news reports, non-opinion pieces, which is what this listener is talking about, you would end up with news reports that are in fact true, being totally dismissed because of someone's background. And you see this already to some extent, right, with the New York Times. Oh, this is in the New York Times. We can't believe it. And they don't provide a reason why it's wrong. They don't provide a reason that this is false or that it is lacking context. It's just, it's in the New York Times. We don't believe it. And that, I think, ultimately is my sort of big picture, not objection to this, but the reason why I don't think that this would solve as much as the writer hopes. It's because everyone knows that the vast, vast majority of staffers at the New York Times and CNN and the other big news gathering outlets, the vast majority of them, at least 70 and possibly 98% of the editorial staffers are left-leaning somehow or another, vote Democratic. Their hearts are with the Democratic Party. And that's something that we already know, and I don't think this would change that.
I think the lopsidedness of the numbers are always really interesting. Katherine mentioned Slate. I think it was in 2016, one of those years when they revealed the numbers were 59, 1, and 1. And one was for a libertarian and one was for Evan McMullen. So yeah, that's 20.
That's not 59%, folks. 59, that's 59 out of 61 respondents.
Everybody. I tried to get this done at the LA Times when I worked in the opinion section, and the those objections were brought up, like, oh, people will all say this and whatever about us, and that would be terrible. And I think it has the most salutary effect, not on the reader, listener, or whatever, but on the institution. If I was running a institution that claimed it all to be like impartial in its gathering of information and transmission having to do with controversial political issues, golly, I would like to know if it was a 59, 1, and 1, because then it'd be like, oh, that gets to the letter writer's number 4, I believe. It won't actually shame anyone. I write a column every 4 years attempting to shame my journalistic colleagues for not following our trailblazing lead of 20 years now and standing. And each year I try a different tack. I think the one that I'm going to use this year is journalists have been boring us to tears in the Trump era about how like objectivity is passé. What we need is moral clarity. We need to write about, when we're talking about politics, stop talking about the odds, talk about the stakes. I mean, everything is, we need a pro-democracy desk. We need to let people know that fascism is coming around the corner and all of this. If you really believe all this, and I'll take you at your word for the moment that you do, then don't you owe it to everybody to argue like, yes, not just I'm voting for Joe Biden, but yes, exclamation point, because I'm not a fascist. Yes, you need to do this. Like, wear it on your sleeve. If you are so like mad about the alleged view from nowhere that legacy journalistic institutions have allegedly embraced over the years, then you should be championing this even more than we do. Because it's transparency, it's building trust, and it's saying, yeah, this is where we're at. So why don't you have that confidence? Because you're cowards. That's why. you don't have the confidence. All right. Last Wednesday, the chief executives of Meta, which owns Facebook, TikTok, Snap, Discord, and Twitter. Snap.
Crank. Yeah.
Come here, Snap CEO. Like, what the
It's the West Side Story social network, right?
They were hauled up to Congress yet again to confess their sins of running a tech business. This time it's from the Senate Judiciary Committee. As ever, whenever the senior citizens and Ivy League populists attempt to browbeat purveyors of technology, the comedy and cringe levels were way past 11. So let's each go through and rather quickly single out a low light. Nick, why don't you start?
So for me, both the low light and the highlight was when Josh Hawley forced an apology from Mark Zuckerberg, who really never should have stopped wearing the zinc oxide sunscreen. I think that was a good look for him. And he should always appear in public in that just to scare people. But Hawley said, you have to apologize for all of the people that you have harmed and all the harm you have done through Facebook, all the children you have killed, et cetera. And Zuckerberg, stammered out an apology. And then he's like, well, are you going to compensate them? And it was like, first off, as bad as Congress is, right? And I mean, they suck, upper, lower house, it doesn't matter. But then Zuckerberg, like, how, are witnesses that stupid? Like, they keep falling for this. I would have loved to have seen Zuckerberg push back and say, well, are you going to apologize for letting Tory Sanders killers off the hook, who was a guy who was killed by cops or sheriffs in Missouri, and when Hawley was AG, let it slide, blaming it on excited delirium, which is a delusional fake medical diagnosis. But I'm just, for me, that was the thing, and this is the shape of things to come. Big tech has created the grounds for a symbiotic relationship with the government, and it means that they're going to have to be whipping boys publicly, and then they will get the regulation that they want. Facebook has been calling to be regulated since 2018. Instagram, you can't go on Instagram without seeing ads about how we need to regulate ourselves better, blah, blah, blah. But it's just sickening.
Katherine, low light.
I really enjoyed the Tom Cotton interaction with the CEO of TikTok, where he was like, hey, hi, I'm from Singapore. And Tom Cotton was like, have you been a member of the Chinese Communist Party? And he was like, once again, I am from Singapore. And it just kept going. And I actually think, this is one of those great examples of like, the little clip made it seem worse than it was. Like, Tom Cotton was trying to make a point deeply ineptly about TikTok's entanglements with the Chinese government and with the Chinese Communist Party, misbegotten though it was. Even so, it was so spectacularly stupid. It was such an incredible unforced error. And my long-standing belief that Tom Cotton is one of the most poisonous people on Capitol Hill was certainly bolstered by this interaction. I always love moments in these hearings when, and they happen every single time, when one of the tech CEOs has the opportunity to just wryly state an obviously true fact that highlights how stupid and grandstandy the senators are being. This is like the classic, why doesn't my iPhone work? And it's like, Senator, I work for Google. Like, there's just like that kind of thing is always a nice moment. So thank you, Tom Cotton, for providing that one to us this time around.
He's the fabric of our lives, Tom Cotton.
Wow.
Peter, like sands in the hourglass, what did you enjoy?
Well, the thing that jumped out at me wasn't any specific bit so much as it was that Elizabeth Nolan Brown was really, really right. Back in May of 2023, she wrote a piece titled Child-Proofing the Internet. It's a great piece, and it basically argues that all of the regulatory stuff that Congress wants to do, has wanted to do, has kind of not quite been able to do for the last decade in terms of regulating the internet, in terms of setting rules for big tech companies and social media companies. All of that stuff is finally going to be justified on the argument that this stuff hurts children. And the regulations won't just protect children. And in fact, they probably won't really protect children at all. What they will do is make life tough for these companies, make the internet worse, make the internet experience worse for a bunch of adults, and possibly even make it less safe and create privacy flaws and holes and, just mess things up in ways that are not productive at all. And so this hearing was unfortunately vindication for the Elizabeth Nolan Brown child-proofing the internet theory of internet regulation.
I generally believe, with apologies to people on this podcast, that no one should ever write a nonfiction book with a through line of argumentation, and they should always only just write it as a long-form magazine article. But
how soccer explains Katherine Mangu-Ward.
Exactly. The one time that I almost wrote a book was going to be a book that was just a history of using It's for the Children to do horrific authoritarian shit. And instead, I got pregnant and just produced a child instead of the book.
Wow.
And that was
you manifested.
It was the right call, but I kind of would enjoy the I told you so of it all
Penguin,
now.
The great old kids-only social media site.
I think that ruined a generation of children pretty clearly.
I don't know. It upped the game, puffin sales everywhere in every way, shape, and form are way up. So
it's that in Mortal Kombat.
My favorite terrible moment at the hearings was every time John Kennedy. We have a John Kennedy in the Senate. I don't know why.
Oh, yeah.
It's a Republican.
No, it's by statute, Matt. The framers wanted a John Kennedy in the Senate.
Every quote out of his mouth was a reason why we need a constitutional amendment to bar people named John Kennedy, and just Kennedy maybe in general, unless it's MTV's Kennedy, from government.
The greatest Kennedy.
He said, you're in the foothills of creepy.
That's a Welchian metaphor.
That's why I liked it.
Yeah.
Asking,
it's an Eli Roth movie waiting to be made.
Does your user agreement still suck? Was one question from him. He accused Facebook of doing a killing field of information.
Wow.
Because users only
Has
see
he
one
seen
side of
that
an
movie?
issue. Like, okay. And on and on. But the worst was, or the most hilarious one was this attempted burn to Mark Zuckerberg. You have convinced over 2 billion people to give up all of their personal information, every bit of it, in exchange for getting to see what their high school friends had for dinner Saturday night. It's like, yeah, I'm pretty awesome, aren't I? Like, I convinced people to do that. So.
And they were perfectly willing to do it, unlike the stuff that you guys are always making 2 billion Americans do.
And now we'll just have to go to the government.
2 billion
Matt,
people globally.
Matt, remember that John Kennedy is in the Senator Diaper seat, so we have lower expectations. He replaced David Vitter, who had an untimely demise. That is always worth remembering, because that's who's running the country. People like David Vitter.
Let's get to our end of podcast. What we have all been consuming in the cultural arena. Katherine, why don't you lead us off?
I would love to. So last week, after I gave a little manifesto, little speech about how I'm really just going on none of the above this year, which I've already delivered on in this podcast, Brian Brushwood, a internet personality of some fame, tweeted at me that I should therefore watch the movie Brewster's Millions. And this is a 1985 movie that I immediately downloaded and started to watch. And the first sound in this movie is the crack of a bat hitting a baseball. And I was like, I've been fooled. I've been tricked into watching a baseball movie.
Did you hear that sound in Dolby Atmos?
I heard it on my little earbuds watching on my phone on the Metro. So no. But I persevered.
So
I kept going. And in fact, it is a delightful movie that is not really about baseball at all. but instead about, among other things, the incredible power of a none of the above ticket. There's a beautiful scene in which our hero is rallying an enormous crowd of people who are wearing sashes and holding signs and carrying banners that all say none of the above in response to just a horrific political choices.
Peter, what did you consume?
I watched Argylle, the Matthew Vaughn-directed would-be comic spy blockbuster. And I say would-be blockbuster because this movie cost $200 million, or at least that is what Apple paid for it, as a sort of not quite direct to streaming, but a sort of streaming primarily property. And this is a movie by the guy who directed Layer Cake and the Kingsman films, all of which were kind of very interestingly libertarian movies. Layer Cake is a movie about the futility of the drug war. You see that again in the second Kingsman film. The first Kingsman film and the is really about sort of the bankruptcy of liberal global elites. The third one is a kind of, it's a less successful movie, but it's a really righteous and angry film about the cost of war and just how much it damages people and how stupid and futile it is and how governments force people into war, and it just makes the world a much worse place, makes life less worth living. And sadly, Argylle doesn't have any of those themes, and it is mostly a misfire over long, not very funny. Even the very creative action sequences that pop up at the end just kind of don't land because the pacing is all off. Sam Rockwell and Bryce Dallas Howard are the stars here. They're kind of funny. Sam Rockwell in particular is a very underrated actor, but unfortunately this movie just doesn't work, and it's really a shame coming from a director who has often been so much fun but also so righteously political in big budget popular filmmaking.
Nick, what did you consume?
I watched what I guess is HBO's Sunday night lineup, although I watched it on Max, the app, and I have no idea where any of this is actually taking place anymore. But I watched Curb Your Enthusiasm, the first episode of season 12, the final season of Curb Your Enthusiasm, which is very good. And as always, it has a reprise of various Seinfeld-related themes, which shows why Seinfeld may have replaced The Godfather as the text of the contemporary. The way that The Godfather was, everybody was doing something related to The Godfather from the time it came out until Saddam Hussein, who used to wear the hat that Michael Corleone wore in public appearances, since he was, his regime change came to him. But Curb Your Enthusiasm, it was a very good start to an episode and kind of a further deconstruction of Larry David and almost everything that is good and decent in American culture. And then I also am, there have been 4 of 6 episodes for True Detective, season 4, which is called Night Country, that features Jodie Foster and Kali Reese. And it's set in Alaska. It's not done by the original showrunner and whatnot, but it had a scene in it that I shrieked like a little girl. It's a very spooky, scary. It's kind of True Detective meets John Carpenter's The Thing, and it's a very slow-moving, build-up show. There are 2 episodes left, and I think it's going to be pretty great. And what I was thinking, the reason I watch these in tandem is I can remember a time in the late 90s and early 2000s when The Sopranos, Sex and the City, Curb Your Enthusiasm were on Sunday nights on HBO. They went with, it's not TV, it's HBO. And The Sopranos, at the very least, was actually beating out broadcast network shows for audience share. And it's fascinating to me to think neither of these shows has a market anywhere close to that. Most of the people aren't even watching it on HBO. People have continued to cut cable. Nobody watches broadcast TV in any kind of meaningful way the way we used to. So it's kind of a world of wonders. These are both excellent programs in and of themselves, but kind of the way in which we consume culture continues to get better and better, even if it means we get to consume more and more stuff, even if their market share is smaller and smaller. And I actually think that's a very nice, positive outcome for producers and consumers as well.
So we are past peak television just in terms of the number of scripted shows that are being produced. It is actually down somewhat. On the other hand, even in our post-peak television era, there have to be at least 5, if not close to 10 times as many scripted shows as were being produced in the early 1990s, maybe even the late 1990s, when there were fewer than 50 or 60 scripted television shows being produced, period, each year. It was really amazing just to look at the volume and the way that the scripted TV market has expanded.
And it's, I mean, when to stay on this a little bit, because I do think it's important. And, you know, we live in a different world. Our economy hasn't fully caught up. We haven't moved into whatever comes after the end of the Cold War, kind of, and the end of the war on terror, the global war on terror. But culturally, we're also consuming very different things. And so, you know, when you factor in YouTube and not just reality TV, but, you know, shows like the Joe Rogan Experience, whether you're listening to it or watching clips or whatever, it's just, you know, we talked a lot. I certainly did at Reason in the 90s about the proliferation of culture and a kind of in praise of cultural chaos and anarchy. And it's here and it's pretty great. Even as you start to hear now, as people get more and more anxious and nostalgic, they're like, oh, where are the water cooler shows? Blah, blah, blah. You know, and it's like, they're not here because we've been freed. We don't have to watch one or two things, you know, at a given time, you know, that are kind of forced on us. We can do what we want, and we still have plenty to talk about in common.
The future is the Reason Roundtable in glorious HD video.
So I watched a water cooler moment yesterday. I tuned into the last 2 hours of the Grammy Awards, which these days...
It's not a water cooler, Matt. You're in a Stanley thermal mug, and nobody watches this anymore relative to the past, right?
Comparatively, it's still a moment that was large enough to drive Tracy Chapman's 1988 song Fast Car to #1 on iTunes, and the album to #1 on iTunes, based on her performance of the song with Luke Combs, country star. He had done a cover last summer that launched 1,000 absolutely idiotic, I don't want to say think pieces, brain fart pieces.
Absence of thought pieces,
in the Washington Post, in the Atlantic, in every single place that certain people have worked. Just awful. The Washington Post one was like, you know, the complicated response to a fast car, you know, it's renewing difficult conversations. It's like, or hear me out on this one. A guy really liked the song and he did a really good version of it. It got popular, and Tracy Chapman was super stoked about it herself. And the performance last night was lovely. The Grammy Awards have transitioned into a live, like, mashup concert over the years. So every year I like to sort of tune in, and then one out of the performances works for me. And this was the one. And it did create quite a viral moment that people responded to. You can, we'll send a link to it. Tracy Chapman was awesome. She looked great. She played great.
Yep.
And there's this wonderful overflowing sense of, like, gratitude, accomplishment, just everything, coursing through just her face as she's playing. It was a wonderful moment, and an absolute repudiation, in my opinion, of every idiotic cultural appropriation or whatever kind of cultural argument that's made in music and in food, the two places where everything should be appropriated all the time and just is lovely, and it's mixed and it's great. That's the whole point of everything. So I loved it on its own, and I also loved it because it just shows that the Atlantic and the Washington Post can go right up.
Kiss your grits, Matt.
They go touch grass.
Now, you know what was great about that too is, like, I watched that like minutes after it happened without having to watch the Grammys. So it was, you know, everything was kind of disintermediated. So you can watch it. I also saw that. I remember I was working at Smash Hits, the American version of Smash Hits, when Tracy Chapman's album came out. And I was like, this is a fucking great record. And it was seen as an angry record. And it is an angry record, but it's just beautiful. And what was most interesting about the performance is she was happy and smiling and jubilant. And in a weird way, that's a dark song, but it kind of wow, like we're in a better place when that is happening at the Grammys. And she is putting a full stop on all of this stupidity that you were talking about.
That's gorgeous. All right. That's all the gorgeousness we have time for on the Reason Roundtable podcast, videocast. Thank you for tuning in. All of our podcasts are available at reason.com/podcasts. Believe it or not. If you like what we do, you can donate to the nonprofit that publishes all of our stuff. That's the Reason Foundation. Go to reason.com/donate. And otherwise, we shall see you next week. Goodbye.